Well, Nigeria is said to have recorded the highest on-grid power output in 4 months. On-grid power output currently stands at 3,890 megawatts. That's up 2.5%. Well, that's our conversation on the commodities market segment, as I'm being joined by one of the research analysts with financial derivatives company here in Lagos, Bolanle Olutesi. Good morning, Bolanle.
Good morning.
Power, electricity, that's all we talk about. Now, that's quite good news. A power output close to about 400 megawatts. So what's contributing to this positive outcome?
Okay, so just briefly running through the burning issues for today. Okay, so first we have the fact that NSE suspended Owando's shares.
Sure.
Power generation from hydropower plants has actually increased by 26% from 2015, as the minister reported. Power generation from the grid has actually increased close to 4,000 megawatts, like you've mentioned. Exchange rate in the parallel market has been flat at 364 naira to the dollar, and diesel price has been flat as high as 200 naira per liter. So going back to your question on power, yes, it's great news. You know, it's been a while since, it's been 4 months since we've seen this uptick in power of close to 4,000 megawatts. So it's good news for us. But at the same time, if you look at 2 years ago, at the start of Buhari's administration, we were as high as 7,000 megawatts. So is that really good news? Should we be happy that we've only, you know, scratched the 4,000 megawatts level? But at the same time, power remains an issue. The GDP figures that were actually released in Q2, power was a major constraint, and that's due to the, the lack of funding, lack of infrastructure within the power sector. So from hydropower plants, we've seen that, okay, there's been an improvement compared to last year, and obviously that had to do with the floods, the major floods we had seen this year. The rainy season was, something different from what we had seen before due to climate change. But looking at the three different, sources of power that we have within the country, we have gas, we have thermal, which is from diesel, which is fueled by diesel, and then we also have the hydro. So out of these three sources, with diesel, if we do get oil, we produce power through the thermal aspect. Gas, we had seen a lot of gas constraints from last year. About, like, I think the minister was mentioning the fact that we had like about 20 vandalisms to gas pipelines and all that. So that already affected production of power using from the gas part of it. But hydro, the Shiroro, I think the highest production from the grid, it comes from Jeba power plant, and then Shiroro, and then Kanji Dam. So those are our major sources. So it's not surprising that power generation from hydro has actually increased.
Perhaps because of the rains, just like you said, because it said that once there's rainy season, we seem to have power output increase. So now the rains are going. Are we going to go back to square one kind of?
Yeah, so from now on, we're not in the rainy season anymore. We're entering the dry season, or if we're not already in the dry season. We've seen rains, just pockets of rains here and there. We do expect that, yes, definitely, hydro, power generation from the hydro wouldn't necessarily decrease, but we shouldn't see an uptick in power generation from that aspect. It seems like we've already reached, our max when it comes to power generation from hydro. But at the same time, when we understand the dynamics of power generation from hydro, we get it from the dam, which is on the border of Niger and Burkina Faso. And if these countries, or there's that risk that these countries would actually, block these dams, and then it hinders, power generation from that source. But at the same time, if they do that, it's good news, because irrigation, agriculture, production and all that. And also, if they do this, then that's, that calls the question, what happens to gas, what happens to thermal, and even solar? We don't actually invest in solar generation. So that's another aspect that you should actually look into.
All right. Looking at that slides there, your power generation analysis and impact, of course, one of the constraints there seemed to be gas. And you talked about an estimated 399.6 billion naira being lost annually owing to some of the constraints that discos have in improving. Just talk us through your analysis and how this has actually impacted the country?
So yes, we've lost about 366 billion annually. But if you look at, from the past year up until now, like I mentioned, the gas, vandalism had it had contributed a huge lot to this constraint. And also, if you also try to understand the dynamics of power generation within Nigeria, there's the aspect of producing or generating from the grid. There's also the transmission and the distribution. So I think when it comes to, transmitting power and all that, that belongs to the government. And there's a lot of infrastructure deficit when it comes to that aspect. There's lack of funding there. There's, there's still room to grow when it comes to, moving the power sector forward. So that obviously is a major key determinant of how power would, be more sustainable and, increase in the next coming, months or years.
All right. So with the power output now at about 400 megawatts,
4,000.
All right, 4,000 megawatts. Yeah. Permit me. Now, what would this mean for the domestic commodity prices? Okay,
so thinking from, the daily consumer and, what they usually do. So they go to the market, you buy some of your domestic commodities. Most times you expect it to be grinded there. Like, for example, tomato, you go there, most times in this day and age, nobody really wants to do the blending at home. You do that there. What happens if there's no power to actually, do that? That already hinders, the ability or the processing aspect of some of these domestic commodities, which would sometimes, or most times, they actually factored into the prices of commodities. Now that we've seen an uptick in power generation, we don't expect to see, changes in commodity prices now. But on the longer run, if power is not sustainable, it affects just the daily consumer, from going to the market to buy food for the table, for the family. You get there with power, you're not able to even turn yam or something to elubo and all that. So that already, provides another disadvantage to commodity prices.
What about to the consumer goods companies?
So the FMCG companies, these are some of the companies that actually manufacture some of these products. The main aspect we see is the cement manufacturers, so like the likes of Dangote, BU, Boa Group, and all that. In manufacturing cement is crucial, especially when it comes to the use of power. The use of power for them is extremely important because they have a lot of machinery and equipment and all the likes. But at the same time, we've seen that some of these manufacturing companies actually generate their own power, even enough to supply the neighboring the neighborhoods. So and what that means is that it puts less dependence on the power generation, from the grid. It means that if these manufacturers are able to, generate their own power, then we should be less dependent on, or the power generated from the grid should be spread, across the region.
All right. What, in your own view, how possible can this positive outcome in the electricity sector, be made to be sustainable?
Okay, so the main issue is not necessarily even the power generation, it's the distribution, the discos. The discos are highly indebted. Most of the money that they borrow, they use that to buy equity. So most times you see what they do is they buy, and one of the major concerns we actually saw in the power report is that, these discos are not even consuming enough power. They need to buy it from the power generating companies and then distribute to the rest of the consumers. So they are not, buying as much because they don't have funding. So they would rather buy only the capacity that can favor the people that would actually pay. I think we heard like a study that mentioned 11 million people using I Better Pass My Neighbor generators. These people alone, imagine if they actually connected to, I'm sure some of them have meters, but they don't actually use them. So there's a lot of, funding issues with the discos, and notwithstanding interest rates as well. Interest rates are very high. So whenever they borrow, it's so hard to. So it's a cycle of bad or negative effects on the disco companies. So this means is that there should be enough investments within the company. We heard of the Chinese investment, about 6 billion invested in the power, or to be invested in the power generation companies. I think they're going to build another dam on the east, Taraba, and that should put less dependence on the Kainji Dam, which is in the west. So that already should favor power generation within the country. But it's a 5-year, it's a long-term program, and power itself is a supply-side policy, so it takes a lot of time before it's felt within the economy.
Sure, exactly. Thank you very much, Bolanle, for your time.
Thank you.
Bolanle Olutose is one of the research analysts with Financial Derivatives Company.